The first human outpost on Caravel did not look like conquest. It looked like stubbornness made physical, a scatter of pressure-warped domes and ribbed pylons hammered into a plateau of violet stone that cracked like old glass beneath the planet's tidal stress. The sky above the plateau carried three suns that never quite aligned, each one pulling shadows in a different direction so that nothing ever stood whole. The local winds scoured everything, not with sand, but with metallic dust shed from the mountains that walked a little each year under tectonic strain. To most species, Caravel was a place to pass over in charts and mark with warnings. To humans, it was a line that refused to be left empty. The outpost had been built because no one else would stay, and because humans had decided that something valuable lay precisely in that refusal. They did not yet know what it was, but they knew the shape of the challenge, and that was enough. Serathal Quinn stood at the edge of the plateau, where the ground fell away into a canyon that glowed faintly from geothermal veins. The air tasted of iron and ozone even through the filters of the suit, and the vibration from the planet's deep movements hummed through bone and machine alike. Serathal had been born on a station that orbited a dead star, raised among recycled air and the certainty that everything fragile could be made to last if one paid attention. Caravel was the opposite lesson. Here, nothing stayed still long enough to pretend permanence. The plateau itself would shear off in another few decades, sliding into the canyon like a continent deciding to sleep. That knowledge did not frighten Serathal. It clarified. Everything had a timer. Humans simply learned to work inside it. Behind Serathal, the outpost's main hub flexed and creaked, adaptive supports adjusting to microfractures in the stone. A few dozen humans lived here now, engineers, analysts, exobiologists, and the stubborn kind of civilian who followed frontiers because the frontier told them not to come. They had named the place Groundhold, a deliberately plain word that dared the planet to argue. The outpost was not sanctioned by any of the major interstellar compacts, not forbidden either, just inconvenient. Caravel lay at the intersection of several claimed regions, none of which wanted the cost of development, but all of which wanted to deny it to the others. Humans had slipped into that gap like a wedge. No one had stopped them, because stopping humans required effort, and effort was something the older powers spent carefully. The first sign that the effort would come arrived as a distortion in the upper atmosphere, a ripple that bent light and pulled static across every sensor. Serathal felt it before the alarms registered, a pressure behind the eyes that spoke of mass displacement and intent. The sky twisted, not violently, but with the smooth confidence of something accustomed to being obeyed. A structure emerged, vast and faceted, its geometry refusing to settle into a single interpretation. It was not a ship in the human sense, but a presence that carried itself through space by making space agree to move. The outpost alarms sang at last, a layered cascade of warnings that meant unknown contact, high-energy signatures, and probable claim assertion. Serathal did not run. There was nowhere to run on a plateau that was already a statement. The vessel settled into a hover above the canyon, casting a shadow that swallowed all three suns at once. The temperature dropped as energy was diverted, and the metallic dust in the air aligned itself along invisible fields, sketching the outline of power. Serathal activated the comms and spoke into the shared channel, voice steady, words chosen for clarity rather than comfort. Contact in upper atmosphere, configuration non-human, energy output significant. This is not a flyby. The response from the hub was immediate, a chorus of acknowledgements and the low murmur of people taking positions not because they expected to fight, but because humans believed in being seen standing. A beam of light extended from the vessel, not a weapon but a corridor, its edges humming with translation matrices. A figure descended, elongated and jointed in ways that suggested a different answer to gravity. Its surface shifted color in response to the environment, not camouflage but communication, patterns rippling as it adjusted to alien physics. When it reached the plateau, the beam withdrew, leaving the figure standing on stone that cracked under the weight of its presence. It regarded the outpost with a cluster of sensory organs that glowed faintly, then focused on Serathal, perhaps because Serathal stood closest to the edge, perhaps because stillness was a universal signal. "I am Envy Kethras of the Raveled Continuum," the figure said, its voice emerging directly into the comms as well as the air, layered and precise. "This region is under review. Your structures are unauthorized. You will withdraw." The words were not a threat. They were an assumption. Serathal inclined the head, a human gesture that had been used for everything from greeting to defiance. "This is a settled outpost," Serathal replied. "We are not interfering with any established development. We are within our rights to remain." The phrase "within our rights" was a human habit, an invocation of a framework that humans carried with them even when no one else acknowledged it. The continuum did not recognize human charters, but humans spoke them anyway, like a language exercise that kept the tongue flexible. Envy Kethras's surface patterns shifted, a flicker that might have been irritation or calculation. "Your species has a pattern of persistence that exceeds its strategic value," the Envy said. "This location will be destabilized within acceptable temporal margins. Your loss is inefficient." It gestured toward the canyon, where the glow pulsed in slow rhythms. "You choose erosion. We choose to learn how long erosion takes," Serathal said. The answer surprised even the humans listening. It was not scripted. It was simply true. The Envy paused, a moment of stillness that suggested the processing of unfamiliar variables. The continuum had encountered humans before, in trade disputes and border skirmishes, in negotiations that ended with polite stalemates. Humans were known for adaptability, for emotional volatility, for an inconvenient refusal to collapse when projections said they should. What they were not known for, in continuum assessments, was patience. That was an error born of misreading human urgency as haste. Humans moved quickly because they wanted to see the whole shape of a problem, not because they could not wait. "Your presence introduces noise," Envy Kethras said. "Other claimants will respond. Conflict will increase. This world will become a node of contention." The Envy's tone suggested that this was self-evidently undesirable. Serathal looked back at Groundhold, at the domes flexing and the people inside watching through feeds, at the delicate machinery that kept human bodies alive on a planet that did not care. "It already is," Serathal said. "We are just making it honest." There was another pause. The three suns shifted, their shadows crawling across the plateau. Somewhere deep below, the planet groaned, a sound too low to hear but strong enough to feel. Envy Kethras turned slightly, its attention splitting between the human and the data streaming from the vessel above. "You will be observed," it said at last. "Your actions will inform future policy." The beam of light returned, enveloping the Env and lifting it back toward the hovering structure. As it ascended, it added, "Persistence without power is waste." Serathal watched the vessel withdraw, the distortion smoothing as space relaxed back into familiar angles. When the sky cleared, the suns burned brighter for a moment, as if relieved. The alarms in the outpost wound down, replaced by the ordinary sounds of human life in an extraordinary place. Serathal exhaled, a long breath that carried the tension away, and turned back toward Groundhold. Inside the hub, the mood was not celebratory. Humans did not cheer for avoided disaster. They catalogued it. Data flowed, recordings analyzed, energy signatures compared to known profiles. Conversations overlapped, speculation braided with logistics. Serathal moved through it, answering questions, redirecting focus. "We were not ordered to leave under force," Serathal said to a cluster of engineers. "That matters. Observation means hesitation. Hesitation means time. Time was the currency humans spent best." In the days that followed, Groundhold expanded not outward but inward. Supports were reinforced, not to resist the inevitable shift of the plateau, but to ride it. Algorithms adjusted to predict fracture patterns, not to stop them, but to harvest the energy released. What had been a liability became a resource, the planet's restless nature feeding the outpost's needs. Humans did not fight Caravel. They listened to it and learned its rhythms. It was not a partnership, but it was a conversation. Other eyes turned toward Caravel. Probes from neighboring polities slipped into orbit, their sensors tasting the changes. Trade vessels altered routes to pass a little closer, curiosity outweighing caution. The raveled continuum returned, not with envoys but with observers, small constructs that watched and reported. Humans let them. There was no rule against being seen, and humans had learned long ago that secrecy was not the same as safety. Better to be obvious and unashamed. Serathel spent long hours walking the plateau, feeling the tremors through the boots, mapping the subtle shifts. The canyon edge crept closer each week, the ground sloughing off in crystalline sheets. The outpost moved with it, inching away, anchored by systems that adjusted faster than the planet could betray them. It was not elegant, it was effective. Serathel thought of the envoy's words about persistence without power. Power, to the continuum, meant fleets and authority and the ability to make space comply. To humans, power had always included the ability to stay when leaving was easier. The second contact came not from above but from below. A structure rose from the canyon, grown rather than built, its surface alive with bioluminescent veins. It was a listening post from a species that had claimed the planet centuries ago and then abandoned it when extraction proved too costly. They had returned because humans had made the cost interesting again. Their representative emerged, a mass of tendrils and facets that resolved into a shape approximating symmetry. It communicated through scent and electromagnetic pulses, which the human translators rendered into careful speech. "You disturb the long quiet," it said. "Why?" Serathel answered the same way as before, with honesty stripped of ornament. "Because quiet was a lie," Serathel said. "This place is loud, we are just willing to hear it." The representative's response was complex, a mix of skepticism and something like admiration. It did not order humans away, it did not offer alliance. It observed, as the continuum had, and withdrew. The pattern repeated with others, each encounter adding to the web of attention around Caravel. What had been an ignored plateau became a focal point, not because of what lay beneath it, but because of who stood on top of it. Serathel understood then that Caravel was not the test. Humans were. The older powers watched to see if the species would break under pressure, if the cost of attention would drive them off. They expected humans to escalate, to demand recognition, or threaten force. Instead, humans worked. They adapted. They stayed. The outpost grew more efficient, more resilient, its systems refined by constant stress. Children were born there, their first breaths filtered through machines that compensated for alien chemistry. They learned to walk on ground that shifted, to balance under three suns. They learned that the universe did not owe them comfort, and that this was not an insult. Envy Kethras returned months later, its vessel accompanied by others of different design, representatives of interests that had decided observation was no longer enough. The plateau trembled as if aware of the convergence. Serathel stood again at the edge, older now by experience rather than time. The envoy spoke, its tone altered, less certain. "Your presence has altered regional dynamics," it said. "You have become a fixed variable." Serathel smiled, a human expression that showed teeth without threat. "That is what we do," Serathel said. "We find a place and make it harder to ignore." The envoy considered this, its surface patterns settling into something like acceptance. "The continuum will not remove you," it said, "but understand this. You will be held responsible for what follows." Serathel nodded. Responsibility was another human habit, heavy but familiar. "We already are," Serathel said. Above them, the three suns traced their endless dance, indifferent witnesses to a species that refused to move when told the ground was unworthy. Caravel groaned and shifted, and Groundhold shifted with it, a small, stubborn answer to a universe that preferred its frontiers empty. Responsibility, Serathel learned, did not arrive all at once. It accumulated like stress in stone, invisible until the fracture lines appeared. After the Continuum's declaration, Caravel stopped being a question of presence and became a question of consequence. Traffic increased, not the careless drifting of curious traders, but purposeful arrivals, vessels holding position just outside the gravity well, each one broadcasting legal frameworks older than human recorded history. Claims overlapped in polite but incompatible ways. No one fired on groundhold, and no one acknowledged its authority, but every maneuver took the outpost into account. Humans had become terrain. The first real test of that responsibility came when the plateau slipped faster than predicted. The models had accounted for gradual shear, for the steady creep of stone toward the canyon. They had not predicted the sudden resonance cascade triggered by a rare alignment of the three suns and a deep mantle surge. The ground lurched with the kind of violence that bypassed warning systems, a single brutal motion that sent support pylons screaming as they compensated. Inside the hub, gravity fluctuated wildly. People were thrown against bulkheads, equipment tore loose, alarms drowned out thought. For 7 seconds, groundhold was no longer a structure, but an argument with physics. Serathel was on the outer ring when it happened, boots skidding as the plateau cracked in a jagged arc that raced toward the hub. The canyon edge surged closer in a blur of crystalline collapse. Training took over. Serathel anchored to a stabilizer, slammed a manual override, and rerouted power without waiting for authorization. The hub shuddered but held, adaptive supports flexing beyond their rated limits. When the motion stopped, the plateau had lost a full meter to the void, and groundhold now sat closer to the edge than any engineer would have approved on paper. Casualties were light, a handful of broken bones, one serious internal injury. Humans were good at triage. The damage to the outpost was more insidious. Several deep anchors had been compromised, their molecular bonding weakened. If another event like that occurred before repairs, groundhold would not ride the shift. It would follow the stone down. The news did not stay local. Sensors across the system registered the seismic spike, and within hours, the watchers responded. A vessel from the species that had once abandoned Caravel moved into low orbit, its presence heavy with implication. A delegation from a nearby mercantile coalition transmitted condolences that sounded like opportunity. Even the Continuum's observers adjusted position, their silence attentive. In the emergency council that followed, humans argued the way they always did when the stakes were real, intensely, technically, without malice. Some advocated partial evacuation, moving non-essential personnel to orbital habitats until stability returned. Others argued that leaving now would signal weakness, invite external assistance that would come with conditions. Serathel listened, said little, and watched the data scroll. The fracture lines on the plateau mirrored the lines of debate, branching and intersecting, each path plausible, none without cost. It was a systems engineer named Marrow Quineth who cut through the noise. "We are thinking too small," Marrow said, voice hoarse from dust and stress. "We're trying to hold ground that wants to leave. We should stop pretending it's static." The room stilled. Marrow brought up a model, a reconfiguration of groundhold supports not as anchors, but as mobile interfaces capable of controlled descent. "We let the outpost move," Marrow continued. "Not fall, move. We ride the plateau down in stages, harvesting energy, maintaining relative position. The canyon isn't death, it's depth." Their idea was dangerous. It required rewriting core assumptions, trusting systems beyond tested limits. It also aligned perfectly with what humans had been doing instinctively since arrival, adapting to the planet rather than opposing it. Serathel felt the click of recognition. This was not retreat. It was escalation of a different kind. Authorization came after hours of simulation and argument. External observers were notified, not because permission was sought, but because transparency denied them the excuse of surprise. The Continuum's response was delayed, its silence stretched thin with calculation. The Mercantile Coalition offered logistical support at unfavorable rates. Humans declined politely. They had learned the cost of dependency early. The first controlled descent began 3 days later. Groundhold's lower supports disengaged in sequence, the outpost sliding along the fractured stone like a ship down a gravity well. Energy surged through the capture systems as mass shifted, feeding reserves. The canyon walls glowed brighter as heat and light were redistributed. It was terrifying and beautiful, a demonstration of precision under duress. When the movement stopped, Groundhold rested on a new ledge, lower, closer to the planet's heart. The air pressure shifted, the chemistry changed subtly, filters adjusted, humans adapted, something else changed as well. The sensors picked up signals from beneath the canyon floor, structured emissions that did not match known geological processes. Patterns emerged, repeating, responsive. The planet, or something within it, was reacting. Exobiologists descended in reinforced pods, their excitement tempered by caution. The signals originated from a vast network of crystalline structures embedded deep in the mantle, formations that behaved like computational arrays, processing stress and energy across planetary scales. Caravel was not just active, it was organized. Whether this was the result of ancient engineering or emergent complexity was unclear, but the implications were profound. The planet itself was a system, one that could potentially be communicated with. This discovery sent ripples far beyond Groundhold. Claims intensified. Messages arrived framed in urgent neutrality, offering partnerships, demanding access, invoking stewardship. The species that had abandoned Caravel returned in force, asserting prior rights with newfound enthusiasm. The Continuum convened a review council, inviting humans not as petitioners, but as stakeholders. That shift, subtle but unmistakable, marked a change in how humanity was perceived. They were no longer noise. They were part of the signal. Serathel attended the council remotely, standing in a projection chamber that translated alien geometries into tolerable approximations. Envoy Kethras presided, its presence steadier than before. "Your actions have activated a planetary-scale asset," the envoy said. "Unregulated interaction poses unacceptable risk." "We agree," Serathel replied, "which is why we are regulating ourselves." The council reacted with predictable skepticism. Self-regulation was not a concept widely trusted among species that measured stability in millennia. Humans argued their case not with appeals to morality, but with data. They demonstrated restraint, documented protocols, shared models of interaction that prioritized non-invasive observation. They did not claim ownership of the planetary network. They claimed responsibility for their interference, limited and accountable. It was not enough to satisfy everyone. One faction, a technocratic polity whose power rested on exclusive control of rare systems, issued an ultimatum. They would deploy enforcement assets to secure the canyon and its depths, human presence notwithstanding. The message was clear without being explicit: move or be moved. The ultimatum forced a decision humans had been delaying. Staying had always been the plan, but staying in the face of force required more than stubbornness. It required unity and a willingness to accept risk not just for themselves, but for others drawn into Caravel's gravity. Serathel returned to Groundhold with the weight of that choice pressing down harder than the planet ever could. The response was not immediate. Humans did what they always did when time was short and consequences long. They built, not weapons in the traditional sense, but infrastructure that made removal costly. They deepened their integration with the planetary network, carefully, respectfully, learning its responses, its thresholds. They shared findings openly, flooding public channels with data that reframed Caravel as a shared scientific endeavor rather than a prize. It was a gamble, exposure instead of secrecy, cooperation instead of control. The enforcement assets arrived anyway, sleek, and heavily armed, positioning themselves above the canyon like a verdict. Their commanders transmitted demands, timelines, projections of acceptable loss. Serathal listened, then replied with an invitation. "Come see what we're seeing," Serathal said, "in person, on the ground." It was an unconventional move, one that violated several of the polity's own protocols. But curiosity had always been humanity's most reliable weapon, and it was not exclusively human. A delegation descended, armored and wary, their boots touching the same shifting stone. They felt the hum of the planet, saw the glow in the canyon, experienced the controlled descent that turned catastrophe into resource. They toured Groundhold, met the people who lived there, saw children playing under alien suns as if it were the most natural thing in the universe. Negotiations followed, not in council chambers, but on the plateau itself, the ground subtly moving beneath everyone's feet. The ultimatum softened, then dissolved into conditional agreements. Enforcement assets withdrew to a monitoring role. No one declared victory. Humans did not celebrate. They recorded, analyzed, adjusted. Late one cycle, Serathal stood again at the canyon edge, now much lower than before, the air warmer, the glow brighter. The planet's signals pulsed in steady rhythms, not communication exactly, but something like acknowledgement. Serathal placed a gloved hand on the stone and felt the vibration, the immense, patient power of a world that had been waiting to be noticed properly. Persistence without power is waste, the envoy had said. Serathal understood now how narrow that definition had been. Power did not always announce itself with fleets and force. Sometimes it took the form of a species that refused to be dislodged, not because it wanted to own, but because it wanted to understand and was willing to bear the cost of that understanding. Caravel shifted again, a small adjustment this time, and Groundhold shifted with it, human-made and human-held, a measure of unyielding ground in a universe that was learning, slowly and reluctantly, that humanity's greatest strength was not how hard it could push, but how deeply it could dig in and stay. Depth changed everything. As Groundhold settled into its new strata, the planet's presence ceased to be an abstract force measured by instruments and became an intimate companion, its rhythms woven into daily life. The air grew denser, warmer, carrying trace compounds that tinged the light with a faint amber hue. Gravity increased by a fractional amount that human bodies felt as a constant reminder, a gentle insistence that muscles work a little harder, bones bear a little more. Children born on Caravel adapted without complaint, their frames subtly denser, their balance tuned to a world that never stopped shifting. Adults followed more slowly, through training and augmentation, through the quiet acceptance that home was something you reshaped yourself for, not the other way around. The planetary network revealed itself in layers. What had first appeared as crystalline computation expanded into a labyrinth of structures that threaded the mantle, each node responding to stress, redistributing energy, recording history in patterns of strain and release. It was not a mind in any sense humans recognized, but it was not inert either. It behaved like a system designed to survive eons of tectonic violence, learning from each convulsion, adjusting its internal architecture to minimize catastrophic failure. Humans recognized the logic immediately. It was the same logic they used in ships that crossed hostile voids and habitats that endured vacuum and radiation. Redundancy, flexibility. Acceptance of damage as information rather than failure. Interaction protocols were established with almost obsessive care. No direct energy injection beyond measured thresholds. No structural alteration without reversible methods. Every experiment paired with a simulation, every simulation checked against independent models. The planet responded with subtle shifts, localized changes in emission patterns that suggested feedback. When humans adjusted their descent schedule, the network compensated, smoothing stress gradients. When they paused, the rhythms slowed. It was a conversation conducted in physics rather than language, and it demanded patience. That patience was tested when the first external sabotage attempt occurred. It was subtle, masked as routine sensor recalibration from an allied observer platform. A slight alteration in data flow designed to misrepresent stress levels near a critical node. If uncorrected, it would have prompted an automated adjustment that could have cascaded into a destabilizing release. Humans caught it because they had built their systems to expect error, to question even friendly inputs. The correction was made quietly. The incident was logged and shared publicly, stripped of accusation, framed as a cautionary example of systemic vulnerability. The response was immediate and telling. The technocratic polity, whose assets had hovered threateningly weeks before, issued a formal apology, couched in legal language but unmistakably sincere. Others took note. Attempts at covert manipulation dwindled. It was harder to justify interference when humans responded not with outrage or retaliation, but with transparency that made everyone complicit in maintaining stability. Sabotage thrived in secrecy. Humans dennied it that soil. HFY Kethras returned again, this time descending without ceremony, its vessel holding a respectful distance. The HFY's surface patterns were subdued, its posture less declarative. It stood with Serathal on a newly stabilized ledge, watching the canyon walls pulse with contained energy. "Your methods are inefficient by our metrics," the HFY said, not unkindly. "You expend significant resources for marginal control." "We're not trying to control it," Serathal replied. "We're trying to live with it." The distinction mattered. Control implied dominance, a zero-sum assertion. Living with implied compromise, an acceptance that not all variables could be mastered. The HFY processed this, its sensory organs attuned not just to Serathal's words, but to the surrounding systems. "Your species accepts uncertainty as a baseline," it said. "This is unusual." Serathal shrugged, a gesture that conveyed both acknowledgement and dismissal. "We didn't have a choice," Serathal said. "Our history taught us that certainty is fragile." History pressed close on Caravel. As the planetary network's recordings were deciphered, patterns emerged that hinted at prior interactions. The structures bore scars of immense energy transfers, ancient and deliberate, not natural disasters, but interventions. Someone or something had once attempted to harness the planet's capacity on a far grander scale. The results had been catastrophic enough to leave enduring marks, prompting the network to evolve its current resilience-focused configuration. Caravel had learned, long before humans arrived, that cooperation with external actors required safeguards. This revelation sent a chill through the scientific teams. The planet was not merely a resource or a curiosity, it was a survivor. The ethics of interaction sharpened accordingly. Humans adjusted their protocols again, adding layers of consent analogues, thresholds that required clear planetary response patterns before proceeding. It was imperfect, speculative, but it reflected a growing understanding that intelligence did not always announce itself in familiar forms. Other species reacted differently. Some grew wary, withdrawing their observers, labeling Caravel a liability best left alone. Others became more interested, drawn by the possibility of tapping into a planetary-scale system without repeating past mistakes. Proposals arrived thick and fast, offering technology, protection, political backing. Humans evaluated them with care, accepting assistance that aligned with their principles, rejecting anything that demanded ownership or secrecy. The pressure did not vanish. It condensed. A coalition of minor powers, frustrated by their exclusion from meaningful access, began agitating in broader forums, framing human stewardship as monopolization under the guise of ethics. The argument gained traction among those who resented humanity's growing influence. After all, humans were still a relatively young species, their expansion rapid, their footprint increasingly visible. Accusations of overreach were easy to make. The crisis came when the coalition attempted a unilateral descent. Their vessel pierced the upper layers of the canyon, deploying extraction probes designed to interface directly with the planetary network. The probes were sophisticated, shielded against feedback, tuned to siphon energy and data without triggering obvious alarms. They underestimated the planet. The response was swift and devastating. The network localized stress around the intrusion points, amplifying it into a controlled but overwhelming release. The probes were crushed, their materials compressed and repurposed by geological forces that cared nothing for ownership. The vessel above experienced a shockwave that overwhelmed its dampeners, sending it tumbling into an uncontrolled ascent. Lives were lost. The coalition broadcast outrage and grief, accusing humans of engineering the response. Humans opened their logs. Every interaction, every protocol, every simulation was laid bare. Independent analysts confirmed what humans already knew. The response had been planetary, not human-directed. The network had reacted to a violation of its internal thresholds, protecting itself with the only tools it had. The coalition's argument faltered, but the damage was done. Fear spread. Caravel was no longer just contested. It was dangerous. Serathel felt the weight of that fear in every conversation. Parents worried about raising children on a world that could decide, at any moment, that humans were no longer acceptable variables. Engineers worried about system limits they could not fully model. Scientists worried about misinterpreting signals, about imposing narratives on patterns that did not share human intent. Responsibility thickened, its mass-bending decisions. The answer came not from a council or a model, but from an unexpected shift in the planetary network itself. Following the intrusion, the emission patterns changed globally, settling into a new configuration that reduced overall stress by redistributing energy more evenly. The planet had adapted, incorporating the incident into its long memory. Humans realized then that Caravel was not just reacting to them. It was learning from them, just as they were learning from it. This mutual adaptation altered the balance. The Continuum convened a formal assembly, unprecedented in its scope, to address the implications. Humans were invited as equal participants. The language of the assembly avoided ownership entirely, focusing instead on coexistence frameworks. Caravel was designated a shared research and habitation zone, with humans recognized as primary stewards due to established presence and demonstrated restraint. It was not a victory in the traditional sense. It was a responsibility codified. Groundhold expanded again, not in population so much as in function. It became a nexus for interdisciplinary study, a place where engineers and philosophers, biologists and ethicists worked side by side. Children grew up fluent in multiple frameworks, their education shaped by a world that demanded humility as much as ingenuity. The outpost's architecture reflected this shift, its forms less rigid, more organic, echoing the planet's own structures. Serathel aged into the role, no longer just a point of contact, but a symbol of continuity. New leaders emerged, shaped by Caravel's demands, but Serathel remained a constant, a reminder of the moment when humans had chosen to stay and accept the cost. On quiet cycles, Serathel would walk the ledges alone, feeling the planet's pulse through the soles of worn boots, thinking of the Envy's early dismissal, of the assumption that persistence without power was waste. Power had revealed itself differently here. It lay in the ability to endure scrutiny without hardening, to adapt without losing identity, to share without surrendering purpose. Caravel did not belong to humans, and humans did not belong to Caravel, but they had found a way to occupy the same unfolding present, each shaping the other in increments too small for conquest narratives, too large to ignore. The universe watched, as it always did, with a mix of interest and caution. Other frontiers took note. Humans carried the lesson with them, not as doctrine, but as habit. When they arrived at new worlds, they listened first. When they were told to leave, they asked why, and then they decided whether the answer was sufficient. They did not seek to dominate the cosmos. They sought to measure themselves against it, to find where they could stand without being erased. Deep within Caravel, the planetary network adjusted again, a minute recalibration that sent a tremor through Groundhold's foundations. Systems compensated automatically. No alarms sounded. Life went on. In that unremarkable moment lay the true significance of what had been achieved. Not a triumph carved into history, but a steady, ongoing negotiation with existence itself, one that humans had proven willing to maintain for as long as the ground, however unyielding, continued to shift beneath their feet. Stability, once achieved, revealed its own fragility. Years passed on Caravel marked not by calendars, but by cycles of adjustment, each one a negotiation between human intent and planetary response. Groundhold became less an outpost and more a settlement, its population measured in thousands rather than dozens, spread across terraced ledges, carved not by excavation, but by careful redirection of collapse. What had once been emergency maneuvers were now routine operations, descent schedules as familiar as tides had been on old human worlds. The canyon was no longer an edge. It was a corridor. With that normalization came complacency, subtle and dangerous. Systems ran smoothly enough that some began to forget why they had been built with such redundancy, why every assumption was questioned twice. New arrivals, raised on more forgiving worlds, saw Caravel as challenging but manageable, its dangers mapped and mitigated. They trusted the models because the models had not failed them yet. Serathel noticed the shift not in reports or metrics, but in conversation, in the way people spoke of the planet as a solved problem rather than a living variable. The warning signs were there, scattered and easily dismissed. Minor discrepancies in emission patterns that fell within acceptable margins. Slight delays in network response times attributed to increased interaction load. A growing asymmetry between stress accumulation and release that suggested deeper processes at work. The planetary network was changing again, but this time the change was not a direct reaction to human action. It was internal, driven by cycles far longer and forces far greater than any single species. The first failure was small. A research habitat on a lower ledge experienced an unexpected shear, its supports compensating too late. The structure did not fall into the depths, but it twisted, its internal geometry distorted enough to injure several occupants. The investigation revealed a mismatch between predicted and actual stress propagation through the mantle structures. The network had rerouted energy in a way no existing model accounted for. Serathel convened an emergency review, the tone sharper than it had been in years. "We are behind the curve," Serathel said plainly. "We assumed the planet would continue adapting in ways consistent with prior patterns. That was an assumption of convenience, not evidence." The room was full of experts who had built their careers on understanding Caravel. None of them argued. They had seen the data. The planet was not destabilizing, but it was reorganizing, integrating centuries of accumulated stress into a new equilibrium that could invalidate much of what humans relied on. As the analysis deepened, a more unsettling picture emerged. The planetary network's ancient scars, once thought to be relics of a single catastrophic intervention, appeared layered, overlapping. Caravel had not been harmed once in the distant past. It had been used repeatedly by different actors across vast spans of time. Each intervention had forced an adaptation, each adaptation leaving behind constraints and vulnerabilities. The current reorganization was not random. It was the culmination of accumulated trauma. This reframed everything. Humans had prided themselves on restraint, on learning from history, but they were still part of a long line of outsiders imposing themselves on a system that had never asked to be optimized. The difference was one of degree, not kind. That realization cut deep, striking at the moral foundation humans had built around their presence. The continuum took notice before humans finished processing it. Envoy Kethras arrived with an urgency absent from previous visits. its vessel accompanied by analytical constructs tuned to planetary scale modeling. Our projections indicate a high probability of systemic reconfiguration, the ENV said without preamble. If unchecked, this may result in surface instability incompatible with sustained habitation. Incompatible for whom? Serathal asked. For all current residents, Kethras replied, including humans. The implication hung heavy. Evacuation, partial or complete, was back on the table, not as a political maneuver, but as a survival strategy. Other species began withdrawing their personnel, quietly dismantling lower installations, citing prudence. Groundhold felt the change as departures thinned corridors and left living spaces hollow. Those who remained were the ones with the deepest commitments, the ones who had reshaped themselves around Caravel's demands. Debate within the human population intensified. Some argued that staying now crossed the line from persistence into hubris, that recognizing when to leave was as important as refusing to be driven off. Others countered that abandoning Caravel at this stage would be the ultimate act of exploitation, leaving the planet to complete its painful reorganization alone, burdened with the remnants of human infrastructure and influence. Responsibility, once claimed, could not be set down conveniently. Serathal felt the weight of leadership more acutely than ever. The choice was no longer about asserting presence against external pressure. It was about deciding what humans owed to a world that had been irrevocably altered by contact, however careful. Serathal spent long hours in direct interface sessions, monitoring the planetary network's responses, looking for patterns that suggested tolerance or rejection. There was no clear answer, only gradients of compatibility that shifted over time. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. A team studying the deepest network layers discovered a set of dormant pathways, inactive for millions of years, associated with the earliest recorded scars. These pathways appeared designed to externalize excess stress, not by venting energy violently, but by transferring it outward into orbit. The implication was staggering. Caravel had once possessed, or been given, the capacity to shed planetary-scale strain into space, perhaps as a defense mechanism, perhaps as part of a larger system. Reactivating such pathways was unthinkable by earlier standards. The energy involved could devastate orbital infrastructure, alter local spacetime conditions, even attract attention from entities far beyond the current sphere of interaction. But as models improved, a possibility emerged. If carefully mediated, if coupled with human-built distribution arrays, the stress transfer could be diffused, converted into usable energy across a wide volume of space. Caravel could relieve itself without catastrophic release. The risk was enormous, so was the alternative. Allowing the reorganization to proceed unchecked would almost certainly render large portions of the surface uninhabitable, undoing decades of careful integration. Humans would survive elsewhere. Caravel would survive too, but the relationship forged here, fragile and unprecedented, would end in quiet abandonment. The decision was put to a settlement-wide referendum informed by exhaustive briefings and open debate. Participation was nearly universal. The result was close but decisive. Humans would attempt to help Caravel shed its accumulated stress, not as controllers, but as facilitators, accepting the risk as the cost of the responsibility they had claimed. Preparation took years. Orbital structures were repositioned or dismantled. Traffic through the system was restricted, with full transparency about the reasons. The continuum contributed modeling resources, its initial skepticism tempered by recognition that this was not a bid for power, but a gamble on coexistence. Even species that had once opposed human presence offered limited support, unwilling to be seen as obstructing a potentially stabilizing effort. Serathal oversaw the final preparations from Groundhold's deepest command center, now embedded within a stabilized section of the canyon wall. The interfaces glowed with layered representations of planetary stress, orbital dispersion fields, and projected outcomes. None of the projections were reassuring. Best-case scenarios still involved significant disruption. Worst-case scenarios were left unspoken, their implications understood by everyone in the room. The activation began with a low-frequency pulse, a signal that resonated with the dormant pathways buried deep in the mantle. For long minutes, nothing happened. Then the planetary network responded, slowly at first, ancient circuits awakening to stimuli they had not felt in geological ages. Stress gradients shifted. Emission patterns spiked, then steadied. Above Caravel, space itself seemed to shimmer as energy bled outward, captured and diffused by the human-built arrays. Groundhold shook, not violently, but insistently, a reminder that this was not a passive process. Alarms flared and were silenced as systems compensated. Serathel watched the data with a focus so intense it bordered on trance, every deviation parsed, every adjustment weighed. This was the moment that would define humanity's relationship with Caravel for good or ill. Hours stretched into days. The energy transfer continued, a slow exhalation of planetary strain. Surface instability decreased measurably. The network's internal configurations settled into new patterns, less compressed, more evenly distributed. The risk did not vanish, but it receded from immediate catastrophe into manageable uncertainty. When the process finally concluded, the system entered a period of quiescence unlike anything recorded before. Caravel was quieter, not in the sense of inactivity, but in the sense of reduced internal conflict. The planet had not been healed. It had been helped to breathe. The cost was real. Several orbital arrays were lost, overwhelmed by fluctuations beyond their tolerances. A handful of personnel were injured during containment failures. The settlement mourned, quietly, without ceremony. No one spoke of success. They spoke of outcome, of data, of next steps. Keithras stood with Serathel once more on a ledge overlooking the canyon, now glowing with a softer, steadier light. "You have intervened at a scale usually reserved for hegemonic powers," the envoy said, "yet you have not claimed authority." Serathel's gaze remained on the shifting stone. "Authority wasn't what was needed," Serathel said. "Attention was." The envoy considered this. "Your species continues to redefine the boundaries of its influence," it said. "Others will learn from this. Not all of them will draw the same conclusions." Serathel nodded. That, too, was part of responsibility. Humans could not control how their actions were interpreted, only how they acted. Caravel would continue to change, so would the universe around it. What mattered was that, when faced with the choice between leaving a problem behind or staying to share its weight, humans had chosen to stay again, not out of defiance, but out of a hardened understanding that some ground, once stood upon, became unyielding not because it could not move, but because leaving it would mean denying the measure of oneself against it. Far below, deep within the planet, the ancient network adjusted one more time, incorporating this latest interaction into its vast, layered memory. Above, under 3 distant suns, human lives resumed their careful, ordinary rhythms, aware now more than ever that survival was not about winning against a hostile universe, but about learning how to remain present within it, even when the cost of that presence was high and the outcome uncertain. After the great transfer, time on Caravel did not snap back into normalcy. It elongated, stretched thin by collective vigilance. Every tremor, every fluctuation in the planetary network's emissions was examined with a care that bordered on reverence. Humans had crossed a threshold. They had acted not as settlers or observers, but as participants in a planetary process older than their species. That knowledge lingered in the air of Groundhold, heavier than gravity, shaping behavior in quiet ways. The settlement changed. Expansion halted almost entirely. Where once new ledges had been planned, now empty rock was left untouched. Some spaces were deliberately dismantled, their materials repurposed or removed from the planet altogether. This was not retreat, but recalibration. Humans were learning the difference between presence and pressure. Children continued to be born, but fewer families chose to raise them planet-side. Those who did were the ones who had woven Caravel into their sense of self so thoroughly that leaving felt like amputation. Education shifted accordingly. Young humans were taught not just planetary science and engineering, but history that emphasized mistakes, misinterpretations, and unintended consequences. They learned that intelligence did not guarantee wisdom, and that survival often depended on listening longer than was comfortable. The planetary network responded to the reduced load with subtle stability, stress patterns smoothed. Long-dormant regions showed faint signs of reactivation, not as alarm, but as recovery. Exobiologists debated whether this constituted healing or merely a temporary equilibrium. No one claimed certainty. Certainty had become suspect. The wider galaxy, however, did not slow down. Caravel had become a reference point, a case study invoked in countless debates about frontier ethics, shared stewardship, and the limits of intervention. Some powers praised humanity's restraint, holding it up as evidence that younger species could mature quickly under pressure. Others framed the entire episode as reckless experimentation barely disguised as altruism. Both narratives spread, sometimes within the same polity, fueling political friction far beyond the system. Humans felt the consequences indirectly. Trade negotiations grew more complex. Access to certain regions became contingent on explicit assurances of non-interference. At the same time, requests for human advisors increased. Worlds facing ecological collapse, megastructure failure, or unstable stellar phenomena asked not for human control, but for human presence, hoping that whatever allowed them to coexist with Caravel could be adapted elsewhere. This placed humanity in an uncomfortable position. They had never sought moral authority, but now it was being projected onto them, whether they accepted it or not. Serathel was drawn into more interstellar dialogues than ever before, often as a symbolic figure rather than a technical expert. The role sat uneasily. Serathel had never believed in exemplars. Humans were not better, only persistent. The next crisis came not from Caravel, but from humanity itself. A consortium of human corporations, operating far from the oversight of Groundhold, announced a breakthrough derived from publicly available Caravel data. They had developed a method to induce localized planetary stress pathways, allowing rapid energy extraction without long-term destabilization, at least by their models. The announcement was accompanied by footage of a test conducted on a minor tectonically active moon, its surface flaring briefly before settling into apparent calm. The reaction was immediate and polarized. Supporters hailed it as proof that humanity could responsibly harness planetary-scale systems, accelerating development across countless marginal worlds. Critics, including nearly everyone who lived on Caravel, recognized the familiar pattern of confidence outrunning understanding. The moon in the footage had no known planetary network, no visible signs of long-term adaptation. The absence of catastrophe proved nothing. Serathel watched the footage in silence, a tightness forming behind the eyes. The consortium had not violated any explicit law. The data was open by design. Humans had insisted on that openness as a safeguard against monopolization. Now it was being used to justify precisely the kind of shortcut Caravel had warned against. The planetary network reacted before any human authority could. A subtle shift in emissions propagated outward, not violent, not defensive, but communicative in a way humans had not previously observed. The patterns mirrored those recorded during ancient catastrophic interventions, compressed into a warning-scale echo. It was not a threat, it was a reminder. Groundhold's analysts caught it within hours. The signal spread through shared scientific channels, its implications unmistakable to those who had learned to read the planet's history. The consortium's representatives dismissed it publicly, framing the interpretation as emotional projection by Karavel's inhabitants. Privately, their confidence wavered. Serathal requested a direct dialogue, not with the consortium's executives, but with their engineers. The meeting was tense, stripped of ceremony. Serathal did not accuse. Instead, Serathal told the story of Karavel in detail, not the triumphant version circulating in the wider galaxy, but the messy one, full of near failures, blind spots, and moments when the planet could have ended everything without malice or intent. "You think restraint is something you add after you succeed," Serathal said. "It is. It's what determines whether success means anything at all." Some listened, some did not. The consortium paused further tests, citing the need for additional analysis. It was a partial victory at best, but it bought time, and time remained humanity's most effective tool. On Karavel, the planetary network continued its slow reconfiguration. For the first time, humans detected what might be described as proactive modulation. Stress was redistributed in anticipation of events rather than in response. The planet was modeling its future, just as humans did. This convergence unsettled and inspired in equal measure. The line between system and agency blurred further, challenging definitions that underpinned many interstellar legal frameworks. The continuum proposed a radical step, formal recognition of Karavel as a non-sovereign entity with limited rights, not equivalent to sapient species, but sufficient to constrain exploitation. The proposal ignited fierce debate. Granting rights to a planet threatened economic models and philosophical assumptions across the galaxy. Humans supported it cautiously, aware that their endorsement carried disproportionate weight. The vote passed narrowly. The designation changed little in practice and everything in principle. Karavel could not speak in councils or enforce its rights, but the acknowledgement reframed interaction. Exploitation became violation. Intervention required justification beyond profit or convenience. For the first time, a planetary system occupied a space in interstellar thought that was neither object nor ownerless terrain. Groundhold became quieter after that, not less active, but more deliberate. People spoke more softly in shared spaces, as if volume itself were a form of imposition. This was not reverence in a religious sense, but a cultivated awareness that presence carried weight. Serathal began preparing to step back. New leaders had grown into their roles, shaped by years of negotiation with forces larger than themselves. Serathal's continued presence risked becoming inertia, a reluctance to let the next generation define their own relationship with Karavel. The decision was not easy. Staying had become habit. Leaving felt like a betrayal of everything endured. The farewell was understated. No speeches, no ceremonies. Serathal walked the canyon one last time, feeling the planet's pulse through the stone, noting the familiar irregularities that had once seemed so threatening. The planetary network registered the departure in its own way, a minute shift in pattern that might have been coincidence, might not. Serathal did not try to interpret it. From orbit, Karavel looked unchanged, a restless world under distant suns. But Serathal knew better. So did the humans who remained, and the many others who watched from afar. The lesson of Karavel was no longer confined to a single plateau or species. It had become a reference point, a caution, and an invitation. Humanity's role in the galaxy had subtly but irrevocably shifted. They were no longer just explorers or opportunists. They were known as the ones who stayed when leaving would have been easier, who accepted responsibility not as a badge of honor, but as an ongoing burden. That reputation would attract both allies and adversaries. It would be tested, misused, and challenged. As Serathal's transport aligned for departure, the stars stretched into motion. Ahead lay other worlds, other frontiers, each with its own demands and dangers. Behind, Karavel continued its slow, patient transformation, carrying within its layered depths the imprint of yet another encounter with outsiders who, for once, had tried not to take more than they were willing to give. The measure of unyielding ground, Serathel realized, was not how firmly one stood upon it, but how carefully one learned when to step away, leaving behind something stable enough to endure without you. Distance did not loosen Caravel's hold on human thought. If anything, absence sharpened it. As Serathel's transport slipped into the lattice of established routes, the memory of the planet followed, not as nostalgia, but as a framework through which new problems were evaluated. Other worlds appeared less inert now, less like backdrops awaiting inscription. Even places long catalogued and exploited carried echoes of potential interaction that humans had previously ignored. The universe felt less empty, not because it was fuller, but because humanity had learned to notice what it had once dismissed as background. Serathel did not retire. That word implied withdrawal from consequence, and consequence had become a constant companion. Instead, Serathel transitioned into a role that existed more by consensus than charter, a connective presence called upon when situations echoed Caravel's complexities. No authority attached to the position, no command structure. Influence flowed only where trust allowed it. Sometimes that was enough. Sometimes it was not. The first test of the post-Caravel era came on a world called the Smera, a superdense planet whose crust floated atop a semi-liquid mantle threaded with exotic matter filaments. For generations, its native inhabitants had mined the upper layers cautiously, guided by cultural taboos that framed the deeper regions as dangerous but sacred. When an off-world consortium arrived with new extraction technology, those taboos were dismissed as superstition. The early yields were impressive. The destabilization that followed was not. Human advisors were requested after a series of mantle shifts rendered entire regions uninhabitable. Serathel joined the delegation not as a lead, but as a witness. The patterns were familiar. Confidence built on partial data, assumptions framed as inevitabilities, the belief that intelligence conferred exemption from consequence. Serathel listened more than spoke, watching the tension between the native inhabitants and the off-world engineers calcify into mutual incomprehension. What changed the discussion was not human intervention, but a reframing inspired by Caravel. Instead of arguing about rights or profits, the humans asked a different question. What does the system do when left alone, and how has it responded to interference over time? The native inhabitants, long ignored, suddenly found their knowledge translated into technical language that others could not dismiss. The mantle filaments were not random anomalies. They were stabilizing structures, redistributing pressure in ways that prevented global collapse. The extraction was halted, not ended, but slowed, redesigned to work within the planet's existing mechanisms. It was not an ideal outcome for anyone. Profits dropped. Some regions remained lost, but the Smera did not break. The precedent mattered more than the specifics. Once again, humans were present at a moment where restraint reshaped outcome, and once again, they did not claim credit. Not all cases resolved so cleanly. On a gas giant with complex atmospheric life, human proposals for coexistence were rejected outright by older powers who had already invested heavily in harvesting operations. The storms intensified. Platforms were lost. Accusations flew. Humans were blamed for sowing doubt without offering solutions. Serathel absorbed the criticism without protest. Caravel had taught that being right was not the same as being obeyed. Meanwhile, on Caravel itself, life continued without Serathel. New names took prominence, individuals who had grown up under the canyon's glow and carried its lessons without needing to articulate them. Groundhold evolved again, its architecture now deeply interwoven with the planet's own structures, so much so that dismantling it entirely would have caused more disruption than leaving it in place. Humans had crossed a subtle line. They were no longer simply inhabitants. They were part of the system's current equilibrium. The planetary network's responses grew increasingly nuanced. Where once changes had been broad and slow, now there were localized adjustments that seemed to anticipate human activity with unsettling accuracy. When a research team planned a new descent path, the network redistributed stress along that vector days in advance. When habitation density increased in one region, emissions shifted to reinforce surrounding structures. These were not reactions in the strict sense. They were accommodations. Debate flared anew about the nature of intelligence. Some argued that the network's behavior now met criteria for limited agency, that its ability to model human intent and adjust accordingly constituted a form of awareness. Others cautioned against anthropocentric inflation, warning that pattern recognition could masquerade as understanding. The designation granted years earlier constrained exploitation, but offered no guidance on relationship. Caravel occupied a liminal space that law and language struggled to define. Humans responded not by forcing definition, but by adjusting practice. New protocols treated the network as a participant rather than a resource, incorporating longer observation windows, slower project timelines, and mandatory reversibility. This frustrated external partners accustomed to efficiency measured in quarters rather than generations. Some withdrew, others adapted. The ones who adapted tended to be the ones already facing limits they could no longer ignore elsewhere. The galaxy's perception of humanity continued to diverge. In some regions, humans were welcomed as mediators, their reputation for persistence and restraint valued in conflicts where escalation had failed. In others, they were viewed with suspicion, accused of cloaking ambition in ethics, of advancing influence through moral pressure rather than force. Both interpretations contained fragments of truth. Humans were not neutral. They had values, and they acted on them. The difference was that they had learned to accept the cost of doing so openly. Serathal encountered the limits of that approach during a summit convened to address a rapidly expanding stellar engineering project near a densely populated cluster. The project promised unprecedented energy yields, but risked destabilizing local gravitational relationships. Human objections, grounded in long-term modeling, were acknowledged and sidelined. The project proceeded. Years later, when orbital paths began to decay and emergency corrections consumed more energy than the project produced, the same powers quietly requested human assistance. By then, it was too late for simple fixes. Massive relocations followed. Entire habitats were dismantled. The cost dwarfed the original gains. No one apologized. No one needed to. The lesson spread anyway, not as doctrine, but as a cautionary memory attached to human voices that had once said, "Wait." Serathal aged visibly during these years, the cumulative strain of constant negotiation etched into posture and expression. Augmentations extended vitality, but could not erase fatigue. There were moments, rare but real, when Serathal wondered whether staying on Caravel had been a mistake, whether humanity's refusal to leave had bound them to responsibilities that would never end. But those thoughts never lasted. Ending responsibility had never been an option. It was simply another form of departure. The final return to Caravel came unexpectedly. A subtle anomaly in the planetary network's emissions triggered alerts across multiple systems. The pattern was unlike anything previously recorded, not indicative of stress or intrusion, but of consolidation. Layers of the network were synchronizing in a way that suggested the end of a long transitional phase. Those closest to the planet requested Serathal's presence, not out of necessity, but out of continuity. Some moments, they felt, should be shared with those who had stood at the beginning. The descent felt different this time. The canyon's glow was softer, more diffuse. The air carried fewer metallic particulates, filtered naturally by new geological configurations. Gravity felt steady, confident. Groundhold now expanded into a web of interconnected habitats, pulsed with quiet efficiency. Children played in spaces that had once been emergency shelters, their movements fluid and unafraid. Serathal stood with the current stewards at a familiar ledge, watching the data unfold. The planetary network had reached a stable configuration that incorporated all known scars and adaptations into a coherent whole. It was not static, it never would be, but it no longer carried the same burden of unresolved strain. The long accumulation of imposed change had been, if not healed, then integrated. "This is as close as it gets," one of the stewards said softly. "Not an end, just a balance." Serathel nodded. Balance had always been provisional, that was its strength. No ceremony marked the moment. There was no declaration, no signal broadcast to the galaxy. Caravel did not need recognition. It simply continued, its immense processes unfolding with renewed coherence. Humans remained, fewer than at the peak, but deeply embedded. They had learned, finally, that staying did not mean expanding, and that presence could be measured in care rather than footprint. As Serathel prepared to leave again, for the last time, there was no sense of unfinished business. Others would carry the work forward, shaped by lessons learned not from triumph, but from endurance. The universe beyond Caravel remained vast, indifferent, and full of challenges that would test humanity in new ways. They would fail sometimes. They would overreach. They would learn again. The measure of unyielding ground was not confined to a single planet. It traveled with humanity now, an internal reference rather than a claimed territory. It was the understanding that when faced with forces greater than oneself, the choice was not between domination and retreat, but between careless impact and deliberate presence. Humans had chosen presence again and again, even when it demanded patience that spanned lifetimes. Under 3 distant suns, Caravel turned, its depths humming with the quiet continuity of a world that had survived attention and emerged still itself. And in that survival lay the truest expression of humanity's strength, not as conquerors of hostile space, but as a species that had learned how to stand on shifting ground without insisting that it stop moving for their sake.